Well, good morning, everyone. We're a little rapidly approaching the noon hour, and you've got an early lunch, I hope, here as well. I'm Steve Flynn, the president of the Center for National Policy. I am delighted to have all of you here today to talk about an issue that I think is couldn't be more important for our country, but also sprawls across our borders in terms of its global reach, and also, frankly, because there's a lot we can learn from others who are beyond our shores, which is a big reason why we have Isaac with us here today. Just a little bit of a scene setter overall. One of the things that I set out to do when I came here in early 2010 was to take this concept of resilience and try to both give it some profile and some definition to the extent that we could support that here at the Center for National Policy. We're very excited that with some great partners, we're going to be organizing what is going to be the main event here in Washington to mark the 10th anniversary of 9/11, and it's a summit that will be held at the museum on September 8th around remembrance, renewal, and resilience. And what it really is set out to do is to both be forward-looking, not backward-looking, and do something I think we unfortunately failed to do on 9/11 and its immediate aftermath, which was to make an ask to the American people who had come together with unity and a sense of selflessness in wanting to help. We never tapped that. So 10 years later, we're going to try to tap that. And we're going to tap it by asking Americans to commit as individuals, as communities, as companies, to essentially being better able to manage the disruptive risks that we can face. I think it is an overarching theme about why I hope resilience starts to get some traction and really some investment and effort and energy. It is probably for the latter part of the last century, we convinced ourselves as a society that we could potentially eliminate risk if we worked at it hard enough. Enough security, enough science and technology, we could eliminate risk. This was true on a health level. We can eliminate diseases. From a military kind of standpoint, we'll make the world safe by marching off, potentially doing very expensive things to do it here, but we could get risk. Well, we've had a series of events, particularly in the 21st century, starting with 9/11, but certainly with Katrina, the economic meltdown in 2008, the Deepwater Horizon disaster of last year, where, hello, we can't eliminate risk. And increasingly, whether a community or country or company is going to be successful is not how they dodge risk, how they manage it when it manifests itself. The skills increasingly that we're going to require to be competitive as a society is how we cope when things go wrong, because they will go wrong from time to time. And it turns out, though, this is really a back to the future, it seems to me, for this country. It turns out, I would argue, resilience has been in our national DNA. The folks who arrived, who were here in the first place, and those who arrived in the first early settlements didn't do this because they were risk avoiders. And those who marched across the frontiers didn't do it because they thought this was the easy way out. They met adversity, they overcame it, and they bestowed to their children and grandchildren a sense of confidence and optimism about shaping the future precisely because of that. So we kind of went dormant for a while on this, and now we're back. We're back because reality is forcing us to, I think, be that way. So one is to embrace this idea of resilience as something that's key, but it's a little bit like prosperity. While we can all support it, it turns out becoming prosperous is a little technically complex. You know, you have to go to people like financial managers when you have to work hard and so forth here, but, you know, there are a lot to be done. And so what's very important is while we talk about resilience as a key concept and producing its value, we actually figure out how to do it. Some, I think, the most important work about framing how resilience can be played out in real crises and disasters is what we're featuring here today with our two guests. And so to introduce them, I'm going to ask Dan Prieto from IBM, who has generously provided support for this series of presentations, work we've been doing around a lot of this resilience work. Dan, if you would mind, I'll put you on the introduction.
Thank you, Steve. My name is Dan Prieto. I'm Vice President and Practice Lead for IBM Strategy and Innovation, and we are very interested, obviously, in the role of technology and how it supports resilience, both in communities, in businesses. But at the end of the day, technology is only as good as the environment, the ecosystem, and the business rules in which it is used. And so I think it's important for us to hear today about how do we lead to create more resilient communities. What is the ethos of leadership? I think we're going to hear a lot about that when we think about preparedness and resilience. And it's only in that context that the stuff that we as IBM do can succeed. So with that, Dr. Lenny Marcus is the founding co-director of the National Preparedness Leadership Initiative, a collaborative effort of the Harvard School of Public Health and the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. And that program is developed in collaboration with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the White House, DHS, and DoD. He's played a leading role in terrorism preparedness and emergency response, developing conceptual and pragmatic frameworks for meta leadership, overarching leadership that strategically links the work of different agencies and levels of government. And that's so important when we think about Homeland Security. It now incorporates a whole host of stakeholders into the national security equation that really weren't part of it prior to 9/11. He's also the founding director of the Program for Health Negotiation and Conflict Resolution in the HSPH is the, sorry.
School of
Harvard School of
Public Health.
Public Health, sorry. Too many acronyms in DC, and when you get out of that,
Everybody knows that.
four-letter agency, three-letter agency. Also with him today is Professor Isaac Ashkenazi. He is the director of the Urban Terrorism Preparedness Project at the National Preparedness Leadership Initiative. He's an international expert on disaster management and leadership. He's considered one of the world's foremost experts in medical preparedness for complex emergencies and disasters. He served in the Israeli Defense Forces as a military doctor, head of medical services in the West Bank, and eventually head of the Public Health Department in the Medical Corps. In 1997, he was promoted to full colonel with the responsibilities of Surgeon General for the IDF Homefront Command and the National Medical Coordinator for Mass Casualty Incidents and Disasters. In that role, he led medical mission teams to give assistance to USA Embassy survivors in Nairobi after the terror attacks and to the survivors of the 1999 earthquakes in Turkey and Greece. So we couldn't have a better group talking to us today. We thank you for all that you do, and I look forward to your remarks. Thanks.
Thank you, Dan. And if I might just before, we have this kind of living room set up and spillover. We actually have about 8 more seats here, so any of these folks, please come in. I know it feels a little bit like you're crowding in, but please come on in, and everybody else please jostle around. It's part of the family atmosphere we have here at the Center for National Policy. So with that encouragement of the crowd to come to your talk here, Lenny, please
Okay.
jump in.
Thank you. And Dan and Michelle, thank you for your sponsorship. We all owe a debt of gratitude to Steve. Steve has been an intellectual leader of this field of resilience, and you're a pragmatic leader, so we thank you for hosting us. And I want to add a point about Isaac. I met Isaac when he was a student in my leadership class at Harvard. Isaac is the lead person in Israel when you think about resilience. He has been to almost every terrorist event or natural event since 1990. And he goes there in the moment to study what leaders have been doing, to bring back lessons learned. And he's been very generous with us at Harvard and now generous with people in the United States in sharing these lessons. So Isaac is a good person to have as a friend. I learned 2 things from Isaac. First, everything I know about resilience. And second thing is Isaac goes to events. And he taught us that the way you research leadership and the way you research resilience is not by sitting in your office in Cambridge. You have to be there. And so I've been with Isaac the last day before the ceasefire, the Lebanon war. We were driving through with 400 rockets coming at us to interview people about how they were being resilient in the middle of this war. We were together in the Gaza war, again, right on the border, interviewing people and looking at questions of resilience. And he taught us, and I speak for Barry Dorn as well, and Eric McNulty, who's with us, we go in the middle of the incident. So we were there. You'll see pictures of me with Mike Brown. We were there during Gulf Oil. We're in the middle, sitting next to the leader, trying to understand what they're doing, and also trying to figure out what do we need to be teaching the next group of leaders so that when they come to this incident, they'll do better. So what I'm going to share with you today very briefly are 10 things that we've learned about leadership, and then we're going to open the floor to questions. And a lot of it, again, you'll see because we were sitting next to the people who were leading, and we tried to understand what were their problems. So lesson number 1 is leadership and what leaders do is very closely related to resilience. And if bad leadership, and this was a word that we coined before Katrina, and it turned out to be true during Katrina, smoking is a public health risk factor. Bad air is a public health risk factor. Bad leadership is a public health risk factor. And if you don't lead well, people will die. or people will be injured that otherwise wouldn't have been injured. These are the pictures I took. I was sitting with Mike Brown in his office. I sat with him when Secretary Chertoff said, time to go home. We spoke alone for 45 minutes. I met Admiral Allen, and we continued our study, sitting right next to them. And so the first lesson that we need to know is that leadership excellence correlates to population and system resilience. And it's not only the leaders of government, it's the leaders of communities. In Joplin, the Southern Baptists were there leading, providing sheltering. It's the leaders of the business community, Target and Walmart, everything that's being done across the system, leaders working together. So bad leadership is a public health risk factor. Lesson number 2. We've learned a lot over this decade about disconnectivity. And it's not simply what we realized is disconnectivity, it's competition. It's, I don't want to work with those people, or I'll have nothing to do with them. Or even worse, I'm better than those people. And we know from the 9/11 Commission report that there was a lot of disconnectivity between the New York police and the New York fire that existed before 9/11. They brought incompatible radio systems. So when the police with their helicopter knew that the building was about to collapse, that information didn't get to the firefighters, who continued to stream into the building. So the second lesson is that disconnectivity among public agencies, which is different parts of DHS and the other agencies that are part of the Homeland Security enterprise, and the public sector, connectivity among these leaders builds field communication and decision making, which is critical. Or in other words, leaders have to role model working together. And if they role model working together, their people will be more likely to work together. Because if it's a major crisis, you need to leverage all the capacity that you can get. So lesson number 2, connectivity. Lesson number 3 is about time. This is another one of those lines that I've learned from my teacher, Isaac. And he says, in preparedness, time is your ally. The more time you have, and the better you use that time, and the more connectivity that you build, the better that you'll respond. The moment the crisis happens, time is your enemy. The longer it takes you to mount your response, the longer it takes you to get assets going, people are dying. The longer, if you're sitting and thinking about, well, how do we build connectivity now, it's too late. There are consequences for your lack of preparedness. So we've been also looking at this notion of what happens pre-boom, what happens boom, and then what happens during the crisis. And so time, it turns out, is an important currency that leaders have. And have to know how to spend that currency. So you need to lead through time in a crisis. Everyone is on a different timeline. So there's an asynchronous schedule. Just give you this, what's said in the room stays in the room. The Coast Guard, for example, during the Deepwater Horizon crisis, knew how long it was going to take to plug the hole. It just was going to take X number of days. So they were making progress, but that was way, way too long for the political system. They wanted it fixed tomorrow. The media wanted it fixed tomorrow. So everyone, in fact, sometimes in the middle of a crisis, will ask people, when is soon? And some people will say in 5 seconds. And some people will say could take a few weeks. So everyone is on a different timeline, and it's important for the leader in working with different groups and different constituencies, including the media and including the political environment, to understand that everyone is on a different timeline. We want them to understand it so they're not surprised in an event. Oh, this is what I expected to happen, and I need to lead this group then differently than I'm leading this group. Lesson number 4. We don't appreciate, and this is another thing that we've learned from the Israelis and from other countries, bystanders are part of the response. We tend to look at bystanders, to look at the population as if they're just, they're just doing nothing. They're just there. They're not part of the response. And though often excluded, people in the crowd intervene and respond effectively. They should be a planned part of our arsenal. They should be part of our planning. And look at what's happened over the last few years. Times Square, it was a t-shirt vendor. The Delta flight were passengers on the plane who stopped that. In Madrid, if you can see this picture of Madrid, there are no officials there. These are all bystanders who were on the train, who are helping one another. And part of the problem in the Madrid response is they sent all of their assets to the first 2 bombings. They had very little left to send to the 3rd and 4th. So it was all bystanders. And finally, in Norway, it took the police a long time to get out to that island. It was all the other people were helping with it. We need to plan and prepare our population that if you see something, we've been saying, say something, but we need to give them more tools, and we need to let them know that you are part of the plan.
But do something.
Is what?
They need to do something.
They need to do something, exactly. So the public should be intentionally included in preparedness and response. And one example of that is when we do drills and exercises, we rarely include the public. St. Louis did a drill of an attack on the baseball stadium, and they included 3,000 people from the public. It was not a usual way drills are done. So the public should be part of our planning. Leadership lesson number 5, the unique challenges of crisis leadership. And one of the things we've done in this country is spend a lot of money on stuff. We've also spent a lot of money on management systems. We're no way critical of the money on the stuff or the management systems. ICS is important, NIMS is important. When we're with leaders in the middle of crises, what they tell us is all of those management systems are important, and crisis leadership is different than management. You need management, and on top of that, you also need leadership, because you're going to be dealing, especially in a mega event, with a lot of unknowns, a lot of uncertainties. You have the media, which are not part of ICS. You have political figures that are not part of ICS. So it needs to be leadership on top of management. One of the leaders of the Gulf oil spill, and it was a moment of frustration, said, we need to throw out ICS, we need to throw out NIMS. And I knew—
This is an incident command system.
It's incident command system.
Yeah.
And I said, I knew that it was a moment of frustration for me. But he said, nothing is working according to the protocols. We had one set of laws from Exxon Valdez. We had another set of laws post 9/11. The laws weren't worked, and yet we need to lead through these. And that's why he said leadership ultimately is what's going to make the difference. Leadership lesson number 6, the political dynamics of catastrophic events. Catastrophes, and this is where the shortcoming of the ICS or the NIMS, the governor, the mayor, the president instantly becomes, in the minds of the population, the incident commander. And so you have to expect that as a leader of a CDC or a leader of a Department of Homeland Security or any of the responding agencies, that you have a political side. And this is where leadership is important. Here we have Dr. Rich Besser, who is a graduate of our program at Harvard and was very intentional about using meta-leadership, briefing the cabinet about H1N1 leading up. And I'll give you the quick version of meta-leadership before we can. So the key activities in a catastrophe are saving lives and elevating resilience. And one of the functions of the people who are leading agencies during events is they need to be reminding everyone, including the political figures. Number 7, leadership and risk communication. You need, as a leader, to understand what to do with information. Sometimes you need to be completely transparent and give complete information. You have to understand what the public is able to accept, what they're going to do with it. And so there is a simple outline if you're a leader during a crisis. Number 1, this is what we know. And in a crisis, you don't know everything. We're not talking about a minor emergency like a road accident. We're talking H1N1. We're talking a major terrorist event. You won't, as a leader, this is what we teach, you won't know everything in the beginning, and yet you need to get up and start speaking to the media. So this is what we know, and you only have limited information. The number 2 is this is what we don't know. And it's important to acknowledge that there are things you don't know. And if you remember, Dr. Besser's outline was exactly this. This is what we know about H1N1. This is what we don't know about H1N1. And we've sent teams to Mexico, and we've got epidemiologists working about it. And number 3 is, this is what you should do. You always give the population something to do. Even if you have to collect something and then throw it out in the back room. You give them something to do. And remember, Rich always said, cough into your elbow. Don't get on an airplane or a bus if you're sick. He gave people something to do. So part of the leadership message is teaching leaders how to communicate in times of crisis. So leadership, transparency, and credibility. The media can be your ally not an enemy. That was another one of the lessons we learned from Rich. He used the media as an ally. They weren't the bad guys. They were part of my way of communicating information to lead the public. We define leadership as people follow you. And Rich gave us many examples of people doing that, and he was very generous in allowing us to observe him and study him and the rest of the CDC leadership to make that part of our work going forward. Leadership lesson number 8. It turns out that in the middle of crises, we'll sometimes ask, what was the most important thing you learned from your experience at the NPLI, or National Preparedness Leadership Initiative, leadership training? What was the most important thing you learned? And people will say to us, and we were shocked by this. They said, you taught me it was okay to make mistakes. Because we're all living under this myth of we're supposed to be perfect. At this point in our career, you're not supposed to be making mistakes. You're supposed to be perfect. And it turns out that liberating leaders to make calculated mistakes, we're not talking about reckless mistakes, reduces their reluctance to act. And therefore, we teach them that you must perceive what's going on, take that information, and as best as possible, understand what's happening. That interface is critically important. With that, then predict what's going to happen next. If you really have a good sense of what's been happening and you've identified patterns, you can begin to say these patterns will replicate and predict what's going to happen next. Therefore, the decisions that you take should be, what can we do to intervene or to change what could otherwise happen, for example, with a pandemic influenza or with a terrorist event, and then you take that back and say, now this is what we've done, what was the impact? You build upon your perceptions and you go around again. So leaders can calculate marginal error from which they can credibly recover. And we did a debrief with a whole large group of CDC leaders, and they said in the very early, we didn't know what to tell people, yet they had to issue advisories. And they said what we decided to do was to give people very, very careful advisories that we could easily correct. So remember, in the first few days, they told people, if there's a case of H1N1, close the school for 2 weeks. And then as they learned about the virus and that it wasn't as lethal as they had feared, they were able to pull back from that. You know, there were some people who said, close the whole country down. That would have been an overreaction. It would have been hard to pull back from that kind of a mistake. So they knew that they were going to make calculated mistakes, and as one of the people, the leader said, we were being very calculated so that we could recover quickly and maintain our credibility as leaders. Number 9, learn leadership lessons from others. This is where we've learned so much from Isaac. This is a picture of Isaac, a heroic rescue he did on one of the missions that he led from Israel to Turkey during a major earthquake. We can learn the lessons from Madrid. We can learn the lessons from 7/7 in the UK. We can learn lessons from India and other countries. And we need to be proactive in engaging those lessons. So we need to learn from the leadership experiences, and most importantly, from the mistakes of others. There's no reason why we have to commit a mistake if, in fact, others have learned that it's otherwise not necessary. And finally, we've put this all together, and now I'm going to give you a whole semester at Harvard in 5 minutes. We've put this all together in a model that we call meta-leadership. And again, meta-leadership evolved not because we were studying all the literature on leadership. We were with the leaders in the field. We tried to understand what would be a tool for them that would help them in the middle of a crisis, and that's where this came from. There are 5 dimensions to the practice of meta-leadership. The first dimension is who you are as a person, your emotional intelligence, your ability when you're in a crisis, you go to what we call the basement, your fright zone. And many times people will go to the basement and they're so frightened they stay in the basement. What we say is if you're a leader, you need to get out of the basement. Go to first your protocol level, and then you can engage in a stepwise up to your thinking level of your brain. We actually give them exercises in working with their brain in a crisis so that they don't make terrible mistakes. The second dimension of meta-leadership is you need to understand the situation that's happening. You didn't create the situation. You didn't create the terror event. You didn't create the flood or the hurricane or the pandemic influenza. You need to understand it, and you need to drive to understand the situation. Combined lesson in Dimension 1 and Dimension 2 is situational awareness, understanding yourself and understanding other people. Dimension 3 of meta-leadership is leading your organization. It's where most of the leadership literature is about how to be a better manager or a better leader within your organization. Dimension 4 of meta leadership is critically important for crisis leaders. It's leading up. We all have a boss of different qualities and characteristics. And your ability to lead up to your boss so that your leader is following you is an important aspect of crisis leadership. So when President Obama 4 times said in that cabinet meeting when Rich was presenting about H1N1, we will follow the science, is an example of Rich effectively leading up. Understanding how to message up, understanding what were the motives leading up, and being able to engage the people that were above him in the government. And the 5th dimension of meta leadership is leading connectivity of effort, what we talked about in those early leadership lessons. And so in the curriculum, it's possible actually, and we spend a day on each dimension of meta leadership. Isaac has a great metaphor for dimension 1. He says whenever he goes out in the middle of a crisis, a mission leader, it's like he carries a mirror around to watch himself. And he says, I need to be aware of how I come across. I need to be aware of my own self, how I'm responding emotionally. And when I'm in the basement, that lower level of the brain is operating, I need to get up. Understanding the situation means that you need to be intentionally aware, and you need to help your followers to be aware. You need to help your leader to be aware. Leading down, one of the fascinating things that we find is, in leading down, many leaders say, well, my subordinates need to be committed to me and loyal to me. I'm the boss. And the most effective meta leaders are committed and loyal to their subordinates, and they get it in return. Leading up, you need to understand the priorities of your boss, the political priorities. One of our colleagues, one of the faculty of the NPLI is a fellow named Bob Blendon, and you might have heard he does a lot of public opinion surveys. One of the interesting things that Bob teaches is that in a crisis, an elected official oftentimes goes into campaign mode. Because campaign mode, which was a crisis that they've experienced, is a familiar set of reactions, and they can do really well as campaigners. And so in the crisis, there are oftentimes, on 2 sides of the table, 2 groups of advisors. One of the sets of advisors are the subject matter experts, could be the head of FEMA, the head of the Coast Guard, the head of the CDC, giving them advice about what's going on in the crisis. And on the other side of the table are the political advisors, giving them advice about how to handle this thing politically. And they're going back and forth. This group, they might not feel comfortable. This group, very familiar. They've been through crises of the media with this group. And they could lean here, and you need to understand that dynamic if you're a crisis leader from a leadership perspective. And finally, of course, the 5th dimension, building connectivity of effort and leverage. So the first 2 dimensions are the personal aspects of leadership, and the 3rd, 4th, and 5th are the organizational dimensions of meta leadership. And it's our hope that what we will be doing, and the alliance with Steve and working with different agencies, is simply raising the bar on our capacity to lead. And this can be a great legacy of this last decade that we can bring into the next decade. So meta leadership is about 3 things. 1, mission, which is to integrate our efforts beyond simply working in the silos of different government agencies or public-private. The method, we talk about the 5 dimensions of meta leadership practice. You've been introduced to them. And the purpose is to be a connected and a resilient system as a country, and to be intentional about how we resolve our crises challenges. So cohesion and unity of effort, influence beyond our authority as you lead, which is what leaders are able to accomplish, and then discipline in the fear of crisis. So with that, I'm going to turn the floor to my colleague Isaac, if you have a few words, or if you have any questions. Questions.
Well,
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I was going to bring a diploma, but we just ran out of sheepskin for you. So.
I'll go out here. Let me begin, maybe if I can, with the, because I'd like to, if can, drill out from Isaac. This challenge that you have faced going to a number of settings around the world, of treating the public not as victims to be managed or treated, but as part of the solution. Could you speak to that from some of the experiences you've had both in Israel and some of the other places you've gone?
There are many experiences, but let's go to the basics. Usually, there is a there is a problem between citizens and government. Citizens are choosing the government, but usually after a while, citizens stop trusting the government. It is all over, not only in United States. But the unique in United States is that the government, they don't trust the citizens. This is the only country in the world that government distrust the citizens. They are not important. Sorry, they are important, but we should overparent them. They are weak. The citizens are too weak. We should overparent them. We should cover them with logistics, with staff, with respirators, with vaccinations, with homeland security, with this. Too much. At the last 10 years, you are building in this country a superficially resilient with very soft core. And the core is the citizens. They are overprotected. And they don't need your protection. They need tools. They need to be partners for information, share information with them, share responsibility with them. That's it, give them tools. They can solve the problems. Look what happened in Joplin. We have many examples. You have excellent citizens that would like to be part of the response. Don't prevent them from doing that.
You were saying in advance, Isaac, about the experience of, the after crises often it's a human response, one that we don't actually acknowledge as much, to one, come together. It reminds us why we are human, that we need neighbors and need each other, and to want to volunteer and give. But sometimes it creates friction with the professionals that go, wait, we don't need, you're complicating our lives here. Either what you're offering we don't need, thank you very much, or how do you deal with that? And what have you learned out of the Israeli experience about how you deal with that universal desire almost for people to want to help and do something, with the receptivity for that by the professionals who are charged with managing these events and responding to them?
Let me go to a terminology again that we are using all over the world, but it is in United States you are using this terminology too much. One is crime scene. A scenario, an event, natural disaster for you is a crime scene. We should close it. We should take everyone out. We will be in control, freeze the area, but it is about saving lives and elevating resilience. So instead of freezing the area, take care of the, saving lives. First, even the police should save lives. And I gave my last presentation was to the police, the New York police, or LA police, I don't remember, New York police. And I spoke with them about saving lives. And they said, saving lives? This is job for hospitals. Or maybe EMS, this is not our responsibility. But if people are bleeding there, who will save them? The first one that will be there. So you know how many cases I saw, not only in the United States, all over, that the police is assisting the bystander to save someone, instead of telling the bystander, go out. The second language that you have, a part of your terminology, is security issue. You are using this word of, this information, we can't share it because of security reasons. It is only the last 10 years. The word security, you have more than 100 levels of security information in the United States. I got this information from the Homeland Security. They were invited to Israel, and we told them that we have only 5 levels of security. How would we secure information? And they said, what are the levels? We said, the secret of state is the high level, and obvious information that you can share, it is the number 1. They said, we have more than 100. I said, impossible. I will quote you, but give me the information. So I have the information. You have more than 100 levels of why to secure information. But this information is not yours. It belongs to the bystander, and the bystander should also bring this information to your level. So this friction between the government And the bystanders are not sharing with you information. And government is not sharing with the citizens information. Remember the Trader Joe's bags in Cambridge? Can you tell?
Yeah, I'll tell two stories. Isaac went to Trader Joe's, and he bought a thing of groceries, and he put it right next to the subway system in Harvard Square. And
but with wires and a big clock, all the
Cartoon
weird stuff.
kind of,
Cartoon stuff.
and he sat on the side with a camera and watched it. And a few people looked in to see if they could steal something, but that was it. And in fact, one of the TV stations in Boston was so fascinated by his experiment, they said couldn't be, and they actually put a camera and they put a big Trader Joe's, they went back, same bag, in the middle of a train station, and only 3 people alerted the transportation officials that there's something suspicious. So we really haven't succeeded in orienting the population on that. We did a panel discussion in Boston, and there was someone from the Boston Police Department there, and he and Isaac got into a big argument. He said a terror scene is a crime scene, and we need to study it, and we need to take a lot of samples from it. And Isaac made the argument, and this is of course what they do in Israel, that you go in, you study it, you do your forensic test, and in Israel, if there's been a bus bombing, it's a terrible scene, obviously. Within minutes, they've evacuated all the victims. They do assessment if there's a secondary device very, very quickly. They do their investigation in less than 24 hours. And then in come an army of carpenters, welders, and glass people. And within 2 days, there's no evidence of what happened. Even they literally reconstruct it. And the reason for that is they believe that the resilience of the population is elevated if they see no evidence, and people can get back on the buses and they can go past that site and they can move on. It's part of their resilience strategy. And it was interesting because this fellow, this police chief, and Isaac, on this panel, were in this frenzied argument, and he said, no, but it's important for us to investigate and find out who the perpetrators are. And Isaac said, no, it's important that you have population resilience. So this is something that's still part of our learning curve as a country. And again, I think the experience from other countries, from what happened in London. In London, they created a mortuary for the victims after the 7/7 bombings. And the families were so appreciative of what was done that they actually asked the officials to rename the mortuary the Resilience Mortuary because it helped them with resilience. So there's a lot we have to learn. But Isaac, you.
No more question.
There we are. I think it's a key point, and one that I think we're really struggling with. I just had an opportunity to testify on transit security. Post the Osama bin Laden's demise here recently, they found some information was targeting trains. And the impulse, not surprised, we have to have hearings about this, what can be done to screen, and so forth. And I draw from my own experience as a Metro North commuter in New York for almost 10 years. And rather than treating the riding public as essentially part of the problem that you have to police, I use this example. There is an unwritten code of law for those who ride the Metro North in New York, which is you do not use your cell phone before 8:30 in the morning. If you do, you will die of a death glare of the 45 or so other commuters in the train. It is one of the most uncomfortable positions a human being can be in a confined space if you go off in that direction. Now, what that tells us is there's tremendous situational awareness on that train. People come on the same seat often at the same time every day. That's an asset for transit security.
Yes, absolutely.
And that's not one that we think of, though, when we think about how do we deal with the risk that these could be targeted.
Sometimes you abuse this asset. Like, your airports. What is this taking shoes off? What is that? This is a bioterror. When you go to the airport, you smell the smells there. This is bioterror. Why to take the shoes off? Why? There is no explanation why to take shoes off. Why? There is a way how to secure the airport without bothering the bystanders. So the terrorists are doing something, and then you punish the bystanders because the terrorists, maybe they will use bum shoes, but they are not going to use bum shoes again. They are not stupid. And you can discover bum shoes in different ways, in more elegant ways.
So here's a key. Obviously, what we're looking at, and this is an element of the resilience does, is a change in the paradigm. And so some questions now about reactions or thoughts to this here. Yes, sir. And if you could please introduce yourself as well.
Edward Marks with the Simons Center. Thank you very much. Fascinating, and your discussion is particularly important, and your insights are not being forgotten. Everybody's taken notes already. You focused on leaders and how they have to be trained and react in the situation, and that's obviously key. But you have mentioned the question of functionality and working across silos or stovepipes, which leads to the other side of the equation, which obviously not your focus, which is institutional, the need for institutional modifications and changes. I mean, after all, how leaders would react were very different before the creation of DHS and after the creation of DHS. And you've had things like the Project of National Security Reform, which we're talking about the organizational side of the question. How do you, or do you plan to link those two sides together, the personal management side, leadership side, and the necessary for organizational change?
Well, we're hoping to work closer with Department of Homeland Security, and they've become very interested in this work on meta leadership and recognizing that you can put organizations together to get them really, those agencies really leveraging one another. I mean, to quote one of the agency component heads, you know, we have to learn as agencies how to leverage one another. Or what he also said is, if we could just leverage one another, just imagine how much we could do. So bringing in this notion of leadership and meta leadership into that environment can be critically important. The other thing is recognizing, as Isaac said, and Isaac, when he teaches at Harvard to the leaders, and some of whom are in this room, I won't mention their names, always says the mission is saving lives. The mission is not building the size of your agency or building the budget of your agency. The mission is saving lives. So how do you focus the leader, and I'm not talking about management, the leader, so that they've made it very clear to people in their organization that it's saving lives. And one of the most powerful things when they're in the middle of a crisis is we note how the leader behaves. And in a crisis, people don't know what to do, so they follow the leader. They literally mimic the leader. And if the leader is very clear on what we're doing and the mission and that leading together beyond organizational bounds, then other people will do it as well. And that's why that model that we're talking about is so important. I don't know if you have observations.
Organization for me is very important. This is management. This is not leadership. We need organizations, we need architecture, we need bureaucracy, we need it. But this is part of the management. And we are talking more about leadership, the psychology of leaders, to understand what is the difference between routine leadership and crisis leadership. It is a switch. Suddenly, you should be different. Because again, we are very perfectionists when we are in routine. We are trying to do our best. And suddenly when crisis happen, maybe you can do 50% of the best, maybe 30% of the best, and that's enough. That's enough. And you should learn to make mistakes as a leader. Organization should not make mistakes. This is management. They should be the perfect. But leadership, yes, they should understand how to lead through mistakes.
And that's particularly true when you're dealing with unprecedented events. David Gergen is the co-director of the NPLI. And when he lectures, he says, our country has been probably in more wars in our lifetime than almost the whole time. But we never fight our wars on our own home turf. And so our population isn't used to the vulnerabilities that populations in other places have experienced. And so we need to understand that as leaders, and we need to understand, as Isaac just said, the social psychology of the followers as well, and that's beyond just organizations. Yeah.
Right. Yes.
Yes, Paula Gordon, I'm affiliated with Auburn University and University of Richmond. I wonder if you have looked at two concepts, one from Mary Parker Follett, another from Abraham Maslow.
Mm-hmm.
The invisible leader of Mary Parker Follett, I think, is a brilliant concept, and it's written up in Benz and Biederman's book, Organizing Genius, where they talk about the Manhattan Project and how when the young physicists who were finally told why they were there began to work 20-hour days because they were all motivated on the same page with respect to mission, sense of mission, purpose. The meta-motivation concept that ties in very nicely,
Yes.
I think, with the leadership. In fact, I developed in my master's program at Berkeley a theory of meta-motivational leadership based on Maslow's notion of meta-motivation, which very simply is being as concerned for others as one is for oneself. It's the
Absolutely.
epitome of a self-actualized person.
Yes.
And
Right.
as you may know, Maslow had thought about writing about and developing his self-actualization theory to apply it to society and societal actualization, which I did in my dissertation. And it has to do with a self-actualized or a fully developed society is one in which metamotivation plays a key role.
Do you want to answer, sir? So we a lot on that, and what we say is the currency for a leader in a crisis is influence well beyond your authority. And the reason why that's important, because when we look around, everybody thinks they're in charge. The mayor, in charge, it's my locality. The governor, in charge. The federal government, in charge. And so the leader has to be able to rally all of those different sources of authority and have influence beyond their authority. So if you can engage the mayor, so the mayor understands what you're doing and where you're going, if you can engage the governor, engage it, then you're truly the leader. And it goes back to everything you said. Thank you.
I'm going to put on the spot, but I will. A graduate of your program is here. Brian Kamoy, who is this first senior director for preparedness policy and the director for resilience created in the Obama administration. Brian, I know this, obviously your office, your work is to advance this concept. Maybe just a word of how's it going?
There's always more work to be done. I know enough to know, not to say we're done. There is more work to be done, and we have tried to move out smartly, but quickly on a variety of principles the President's articulated that support this notion of enhancing the resilience of the country. The creation of the Resilience Director of the National Security Staff in and of itself conveys the importance that resilience plays in our national security as a foundation. But earlier this year, issued a presidential policy directive on national preparedness that really speaks to some of the concepts of engaging the entire community. So not just government at all levels, but the private and nonprofit sector, and even more importantly for this conversation, communities and individuals in enhancing our common security and resilience, focusing on the key things or the key capabilities we need to do to respond to events, regardless of what causes them. And again, the individuals are part of that solution. And then one piece of this that I think everyone is focused on at the moment, particularly in fiscally constrained environments, is how do we measure it? How do we measure our level of preparedness or our level of resilience so that we can know where we are and track progress over time? And so there's always more work to be done, but the concept is fully integrated, whether at FEMA with the Administrator Fugate's approach to whole community, which is consistent, and the steps he's taking to involve people and communities in planning and response, and talking about people who have gone through a disaster as survivors rather than victims, because they have a role to play.
Good.
But throughout the federal family, working with our state and local colleagues to advance these concepts.
Maybe the extent to which there's international engagement on this, what are you seeing from your high peak?
We have visited with a number of our counterparts in other countries, and they are fortunately working on very similar themes and concepts out of a recognition that it can't only be government solutions to these problems and to these challenges. Sometimes the challenge is too big, or other times, it takes a government too long to get to anything. But also out of a recognition that the people are closest to it, obviously have a great stake in what happens. But we have had conversations about what is the, what are the best practices and how do we apply them. In fact, that's an ongoing dialogue.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Yeah, hi. I'm Mike Kraft. I worked on communications issues when I was with the State Department Counterterrorism Section during crisis. Now doing some work with Mike McDonald, the resiliency group, and was an observer of an exercise in San Diego recently which is testing the social media, and the problems involved with all this information coming on Twitter. So I want to pick up on number 7. I mean, one of the main problems for managers is you get a flood of information, trying to figure out what is accurate
Right.
and what can you say to the public and media. And it's greatly complicated by Twitter and Facebook. Have you had a chance to look into that complications and any kind of lessons learned? Because certainly in the San Diego exercise, I imagine the same thing happened in Tokyo and earlier in Christchurch. You know, just a flood of information, and it's so hard to verify. And then I happen to be having coffee with Dr. Dan, one of your successors, the day after the terrorist attack in the Jerusalem bus station, and he was telling me there's some false information coming in. Now, whether it was done intentionally or not, but you know, I can see as a counterterrorism specialist the potential for mischief of bad guys putting in false information to divert research. Have you had a chance to really address this issue, which seems to me is going to be a real knotty problem in dealing with future crises?
Well, as somebody of my generation who's still on a learning curve on this, we actually have now a much larger component on working with the social media. And the social media first is a way of pulling information and knowing that there's a range of credibility on that. And the second piece is then how to use the social media to move information out. One of the elements of the experience when the leaders, we have about 50 leaders, government leaders, who come up to Harvard every year, and they get infused with meta leadership through a week in December, and then they go home and they have to, as small groups, work on meta leadership projects that are interagency projects that demonstrate leadership and come back and then make their presentations. And this year we had 2 groups that looked at social media and leadership and crisis leadership, and developed a website and a wiki site, and they're really, really leaning forward on this. So I think this is part of an evolution that we're going through, and you're right. Not all the information, and they mentioned this, not all the information is always accurate, and it's an important tool.
Social media is important. It is a great tool for us to understand what happened in the field, but the problem that the evolution of social media in the United States would be that the government will try to control the social media during crisis, try to not manipulate, but to control it and to maybe, to move information to this social media. Don't do this. Give the freedom to the social media. This is a tool for the bystanders. Don't control it. You can use it. Be part of it, but don't try to control it, because our 2 groups try to build a system how you can control it, how you can manage it. You can't manage. This is something that it is too big to manage. From Japan, yes, there are many false messages. So what?
But you don't exclude the possibility of using it, like to give guidance to the public, whether to stand.
Impossible. If they will see that the government gave this through the social media, they are not going to believe you during crisis. This is one of the problems. They will believe each other. So if you are acting as a bystander or as a part of a group that you were part of the group for a long time, during preparedness, they will believe you. If you intervene to this social net during crisis, they are not going to believe you. You should be their ally, their Facebook friend during preparedness, not during crisis.
Very important. David Kaufman with FEMA highlights something that hopefully drills this
Yes.
directly home. If I had a fire alarm go off here or in any office space, what do you do? Do you immediately take that as an authoritative message that you must pack up and get out, or do you look around to see what else everybody else is doing?
Yes. It's a good example.
Hey, is anybody taking this seriously here? Is this something we should, is this a kind of drill? Is it something got in the system or something? We look for social cues immediately in something that can trigger crisis before we act. And if people are living in a social network where they get information and they've established trust, you're going to harness that, not fight it.
Yes.
And I think that's an opportunity we should be looking at. It has all sorts of complexity to it, but it's something that we have here. That's how we behave, and it's something that we need to capitalize on. A question over here, and I'm going to ask one from our crew out there that can always feel like you're removed, so if somebody come up with one. Let me get one here, and then we're going to have to wrap it up. Go ahead, sir.
David French. I'm with E&S Resources. We have the pleasure of representing the Washington Suburban Sanitary Commission, which is the 7th largest water wastewater entity in the nation. I was going to actually send a word of praise for FEMA in the National Capital Region and how they seem to have taken in the resiliency message and working down the ladder in regards to issues. But my question is related to the Gulf spill and Admiral Allen. Would he be considered a poster child for the efforts that you're pursuing?
Thad demonstrates many of the qualities of leadership that we hope will be demonstrated by other people. He's not perfect. He's been a very, very strong ally for us in the program and a proponent of meta leadership. There's several qualities to Admiral Allen that I think we should note. One of them is he's very curious about leadership, and he's always working to improve his capacity to lead, which is an important quality in and of itself. Not everybody who considers themselves a leader has that quality. Second off, Admiral Allen has a phrase that he always uses. He says, if you're going to go hunting, you get dogs that hunt. And he always surrounds himself with very, very strong people. And one of the metrics that we can use to assess how strong or how great a leader is the strength of the people around them. If you find a leader with very, very weak people around him, it's probably a weak leader. If you find a leader with very strong people around him, very strong leader. And he always goes for very, very strong people. And the third attribute of Admiral Allen is he's very clear that he can't control everything. That actually gives him more control, which is there's certain things I can't do or we can't do or that are beyond our control or that we can't know. And he's very, very clear about that as a leader. And it turns out that those qualities, which we try and learn from and try and figure out how to teach to other people, are things that we've learned from him, and it's been a very, very wonderful alliance with him. He's a good friend.
Anybody out here? Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Yes, sir. Mike Silas from NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Early on, you spoke about the value of time before a crisis. I just wondered if either of you or if any of the three of you had advice as to how to keep the public and the government engaged absent a crisis.
Isaac.
To keep them engaged when?
Without a crisis.
Without a crisis. This is a challenge. But you have so many crisis situations in the United States that you forgot it. You think that you are a sterile country, but you have so many crises. And look, there is, let's say that there is a bomb in Russia. So instead of just sending information to the newspapers, use it as leverage to your public. You can tell them that if something as that will happen in United States, you should do this and that. But you are not. You are talking about something that happened in Russia like it was there. It is not here. Japan, you abused the prime minister there. Instead of learning his mistakes and talking to your public and explaining them how should they react like the Japanese, the resilience. You saw the resilience? This is an example of high resilience. So you should use examples that are happening in the United States, in your borders, and also international examples for your community. We don't have any crisis at the last 7 years, real crisis in Israel. So we are using Joplin, we are using Japan, we are sending experts to these countries in 24 hours, and we are bringing after 4 days all the lessons learned, and we are trying to implement them. While the attention of the public is still there, we send the information because their radar is still open. After a while, it's blocked and that's it. You can't message the public. So you have to wait for windows of opportunity. There are windows of opportunity in United States and international. And it is about time that it will happen here. It is about time.
If I might, there I think is some discontinuity between what counts as a crisis at the national level is it's mega. It has to be really big.
Right.
Obviously, it can be a real crisis in your home if there's a fire in your kitchen, and that's not going to get Washington's attention. The extent to which non-security, particularly disaster-related things, are really learning experiences and can be is typically Washington's not focused on, because security is all fundamentally about preventing things from happening in the first place, largely beyond our shores. So I think one element of it is acknowledging these other crises that probably have a higher probability of loss of life and certainly damage of property and so forth than a man-made, what we define as a national security threat. I can't come up with a single terrorist attack short of a large nuclear weapon going off in a major city than the destruction of property wrought by Hurricane Katrina. And if you talk about, come up with one that could take out as much of a city as what happened in Joplin. And yet that's that low order local stuff that somebody's got to be doing. We're working on the really important stuff up here. So part of it is how do we harness a lot of what happens in our societies as learning experiences and push that knowledge out across communities, I think, is key. Well, I really want to thank our guests here today, because what they have done and what they continue to do is to train and educate the leaders who we're turning to as people to make this happen. I hope you live a long, long time, both of you, because the need is going to be obviously down here. But the good news is this core has, how many graduates do you have now?
350.
350, so it's growing.
Right.
All right,
Exactly.
and I keep bumping into them wherever I go. And it's important that these concepts can be learned, they can be practiced, and then as people model them, it's clear that others can grow. But we got to get this right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.